June 22, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. Across a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, 637 German aircraft crossed the Soviet border, flying east at low altitude in complete darkness. They were flying without navigation lights. Their engines had been synchronized to reduce acoustic signature. The men in the cockpits had been briefed the previous evening. Most of them had been told, for the first time, what the target was. Soviet airfields. The planning for this operation had begun months earlier. German aerial reconnaissance had been penetrating Soviet airspace since the spring of 1941, photographing Soviet airfields in the western military districts with thoroughness that the Soviet air defense system had been unable to prevent. By June, the Luftwaffe had compiled a target list of 66 Soviet airfields within range of the opening strikes. The aircraft on those fields had been photographed, counted, and in many cases individually identified by type. The Soviet aircraft were parked in rows. They were parked in rows because Soviet airfield doctrine of the period called for precise geometric parking arrangements that simplified ground handling and refueling. The doctrine had been developed for peacetime efficiency. It was optimal for destruction from the air. By the time the sun rose on June 22, 1941, the first wave of strikes had already hit 27 airfields. The aircraft on the ground had burned before their crews reached them. In some cases, the crews had not been woken. The war had begun while they slept. The strikes continued through the morning in waves. The second wave hit fields the first had missed or had only partially destroyed. The third wave hit fields where surviving aircraft had been observed attempting to take off. German fighter pilots who encountered Soviet aircraft in the air during the morning described opposition that ranged from disorganized to non-existent. The Soviet pilots who did manage to get airborne were often flying into combat without briefing, without formation, without coordination, against an enemy that had been planning this morning for months. By the end of June 22, 1941, German records indicated destruction of approximately 1,800 Soviet aircraft on the ground and an additional 700 in air combat. Soviet records, which became available to researchers after the collapse of the Soviet Union, put the total losses higher. The figure most commonly accepted by historians working from both sets of records is approximately 3,800 to 4,000 Soviet aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair on the first day of Operation Barbarossa. The exact number varies by source and methodology. The number does not matter as much as what it meant, or rather, what the Germans believed it meant, and what it actually meant and the distance between those two things. What the Germans believed it meant was that the Soviet Air Force had been strategically defeated. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, who commanded the Luftwaffe, reported to Hitler that Soviet air power had been effectively destroyed as a factor in the campaign. The operational planning for Barbarossa had allocated approximately 4 weeks for the defeat of Soviet air power as a precondition for the ground campaign, proceeding without effective air opposition. The events of June 22nd suggested that 4 weeks had been compressed into a single morning. What the first day's destruction actually meant required a different set of questions than the ones the Luftwaffe was asking. The first question was, how many aircraft did the Soviet Union have? The German intelligence assessment in June 1941 estimated Soviet frontline aircraft strength at approximately 8,000 to 10,000 machines of all types. This figure was wrong by a significant margin. Soviet records show that the Western military districts alone had approximately 12,000 aircraft at the beginning of Barbarossa. Total Soviet air strength across all theaters was substantially higher. The 4,000 aircraft destroyed on June 22nd, catastrophic as the loss was in human and material terms, represented a proportion of Soviet air strength that was devastating but not final. The second question was, how many aircraft could the Soviet Union build? This question the German intelligence assessment did not answer correctly because it could not answer correctly. The Soviet aircraft industry had been in a state of rapid expansion since 1939, driven by the lessons of the Spanish Civil War, the Finnish Winter War, and the Soviet military's own assessment of what air power would require in a major war. The production figures were classified at the highest Soviet levels. German intelligence had fragments of information, but not a complete picture. What the complete picture showed, as it became available to researchers decades after the war, was that Soviet aircraft production in 1941 totaled approximately 15,000 machines despite the catastrophic losses and disruption of the first months of Barbarossa. In 1942, it was 25,000. In 1943, it was 35,000. In 1944, it was 40,000. The Luftwaffe destroyed 4,000 Soviet aircraft on June 22, 1941. The Soviet Union replaced them and built 30,000 more by the end of the year. The third question, and the one that would shape the entire subsequent air war, was, what was the Luftwaffe's own production capacity? This question the German leadership understood the answer to, and the answer was a foundation of a strategic problem that no tactical success, however overwhelming, could resolve. In 1941, German aircraft production totaled approximately 11,000 machines. In 1942, it was approximately 14,000. These figures reflected a deliberate policy decision made by the German leadership before the war began and maintained through the early years of the war, a decision that the Luftwaffe would be a tactical air force supporting ground operations rather than strategic force requiring the massive industrial base that strategic bombing and strategic air defense required. The decision made sense in the context of the wars Germany fought between 1939 and 1941. The campaigns in Poland, Norway, France, and the Balkans were short. The Luftwaffe's role was to support the Army in operations expected to last weeks. The aircraft losses in short campaigns were manageable. The production rate was sufficient to replace losses and maintain strength. The decision made no sense in the context of a war against the Soviet Union, whose territory was vast, whose resources were enormous, whose production capacity was unknown to German intelligence, and whose military doctrine called for absorbing massive initial losses and rebuilding rather than avoiding the initial losses. Germany had built a tactical air force for short campaigns and was now using it in a long campaign against an enemy whose approach to attrition was fundamentally different from anything the Luftwaffe's production base had been designed to handle. The man who understood this most clearly, and who had argued against it before the war began, was Luftwaffe General Staff Officer Werner Mulders, the leading German ace of the early war period. Mulders had seen in Spain and in the early campaigns what air combat had sustained operational tempo did to aircraft and pilots. He understood, in ways that Göring did not, that the rate of consumption in a sustained campaign exceeded the rate of replacement at current production levels. He died in a flying accident in November 1941, before the consequences of what he understood became fully visible. His warnings had not changed policy. The man who bore most responsibility for the policy was Göring himself. Göring's relationship with Hitler had given him institutional power that exceeded his operational competence. His management of the Luftwaffe was characterized by overconfidence in what the force could achieve and underestimation of the industrial requirements to sustain what it was being asked to do. His report to Hitler after June 22nd that Soviet air power had been effectively destroyed was not a lie. It was an analysis that stopped asking questions at the point where the answers were uncomfortable. To understand what the Luftwaffe's air war over the Soviet Union looked like from the cockpit, rather than from the headquarters map, you have to understand what sustained operations at that tempo meant for the men flying them. The German pilot who had flown combat missions in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, in the Battle of Britain in 1940, and in Barbarossa in 1941 had been in continuous operational service for 2 years. The Battle of Britain had been the first sustained campaign that had genuinely threatened the Luftwaffe's pilot strength. The losses over England in the summer and autumn of 1940 had been significant, and a replacement pipeline, which had been designed for a shorter and less intensive war, had not fully compensated for them. By June 1941, the experienced pilot strength of the Luftwaffe was already below what had been in September 1939 in qualitative terms. The men who had learned their trade in the Spanish Civil War and the early campaigns, the pilots whose experience was irreplaceable, had been dying at a rate that the training establishment could not match in quality. The replacements coming through the pipeline were technically adequate. They were not the pilots they were replacing. The air war over the Soviet Union consumed pilots and aircraft at a rate that the training establishment had not been built to replenish. The operational tempo on the Eastern Front was higher than anything the Luftwaffe had previously sustained. The distances were greater. The logistical challenges were more severe. The Soviet opposition, which German pilots had initially found manageable in quality, if not in quantity, was improving with consistency that reflected the fact that Soviet pilot training and tactical doctrine were absorbing the lessons of the early war at an institutional level. A Soviet pilot in 1941 and a Soviet pilot in 1943 were not the same kind of opponent. The 1941 pilot had been trained on pre-war doctrine, had in many cases never fired his guns in anger before June 22nd, and was operating an aircraft type that was in several respects inferior to what the Luftwaffe was flying. The 1943 pilot had survived 2 years of the most intensive air combat in history, had absorbed the tactical lessons that survival required, and was increasingly flying aircraft that had benefited from the same accelerating production and development program that had replaced the 4,000 losses of June 22nd and then doubled that replacement twice over. The aircraft improvement was significant. The Yakovlev Yak, one that had been one of the better Soviet fighters in 1941, had been developed through successive variants into the Yak-9 and Yak-3 of 1943 and 1944, aircraft that were competitive with the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in most performance parameters and in some superior to it. The Lavochkin La-5 and La-7 series had evolved through the same process of accelerated wartime development to produce fighters that German pilots of 1944 encountered with a respect significantly different from the contempt with which their predecessors had engaged Soviet aircraft in 1941. The Luftwaffe's own aircraft development had not stood still. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, introduced in 1941, had been a genuine technological advance that had temporarily restored German qualitative superiority over the Soviet fighters encountered. But the gap had narrowed and then closed because the Soviet development program was running faster than the German one. Fueled by a production base that was growing while the German production base was not growing fast enough to matter. The production numbers tell the story in their simplest form. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union produced approximately 158,000 aircraft of all types. Germany produced approximately 119,000. On the Eastern Front, where both totals were concentrated, the Soviet numerical advantage compounded every year. In 1941, the Luftwaffe could partially compensate for the growing numerical disadvantage through qualitative superiority and superior tactical doctrine. By 1944, it could not. There were too many Soviet aircraft and not enough German ones, and the gap was widening, not closing. The Luftwaffe's losses on the Eastern Front between June 1941 and May 1945 are estimated at approximately 45,000 aircraft. The pilot losses were proportionally devastating because aircraft can be rebuilt from industrial capacity, but experienced pilots cannot be rebuilt from any capacity in the time available. The men who flew the opening strikes on June 22, 1941, the men who destroyed 4,000 Soviet aircraft in the morning, were by 1943 mostly dead, captured, or flying with the accumulated injuries of years of sustained combat. The men who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and facing an opposition that had been improving continuously for 2 years while German training standards had been degrading under pressure of pilot shortages. The decision point at which this trajectory became irreversible is not a single moment. It is an accumulation of decisions. The initial decision to build a tactical rather than strategic air force. The decision after June 22nd to treat the destruction of Soviet aircraft as a strategic rather than operational accomplishment. The decision through 1942 to maintain operational tempo on the Eastern Front without the production base to sustain it. The decision in 1943 to add the strategic bombing defense burden on top of the Eastern Front commitment without the force to carry both. The decision in 1944 to continue fighting on all fronts without the pilot strength to fly effectively on any of them. Each decision followed from the previous one. None of them, at the time it was made, looked like the decisive error. The decisive error had been made before the war began, in the assumption that the wars Germany would fight would be short, that a tactical air force was sufficient for short wars, and that the Soviet Union, if it came to war, would be a short war. On the morning of June 22, 1941, 637 German aircraft crossed the Soviet border and in the following hours destroyed more aircraft than had been lost in any single day in the history of air warfare. The pilots who flew those missions were among the best trained and most experienced in the world. The planning that put them in position to achieve what they achieved was meticulous and executed almost perfectly. None of it was enough. Not because the operation was flawed. Because the question the operation answered, how many Soviet aircraft can we destroy on the first day, was not the question that mattered. The question that mattered was how many Soviet aircraft will there be on the last day. The answer to that question had been determined not by the Luftwaffe on June 22, 1941, but by Soviet industrial policy in the 1930s, by the factories the Soviets had built east of the Urals, by the production programs they had run, by the pilot training pipelines they had established, and by the fundamental decision the Soviet military had made before the war began that the correct response to initial catastrophic loss was not to avoid the loss, but to replace it faster than the enemy could inflict it. Germany could not inflict losses faster than the Soviet Union could replace them, not after the first day, not after the first year. And on some level, in the parts of German high command that were paying attention to the right numbers rather than the satisfying ones, this had been known since before the first aircraft crossed the border. The 4,000 aircraft destroyed on June 22nd were real. The victory they represented was real, within the terms of the question that had been asked. The terms of the question were wrong. By the time that became clear, the trajectory of the air war had been fixed by 4 years of production decisions that could not be reversed in the time that remained. The last German aircraft over the Eastern Front flew in May 1945. The Soviet Air Force that had lost 4,000 aircraft on the first morning of the war had, by its end, produced and flown more aircraft than any air force in history to that point. The men who survived to fly them at the end were better trained, better equipped, and more experienced in the specific requirements of the air war they were fighting than the men who had fled their burning aircraft on June 22, 1941 had been. Germany had won the largest single air battle in history and lost the air war. The two facts are not contradictory. The first fact was about one morning. The second fact was about 4 years, 2 industrial economies, and a question that the first morning had answered in the wrong direction.